What's up guys, SLOTH here, and today I'm gonna give you my first impression of Smite Tactics. For those of you who don't know what Smite Tactics is, a quick overview. Smite Tactics is an upcoming game by HiRez Studios, who have made the third-person MOBA Smite. The game is currently in alpha, and it's kind of a mix of a card game and a round-based strategy game, more or less, with a bit of a question mark there, and somewhat of a board game, really. The game revolves around Smite's universe. The same gods from the different Pantheons are to be found in Smite Tactics as well. So if you are familiar with the Smite franchise or the Smite game itself, then most of the characters here will be known to you. The concept in itself differs a little bit aside of the mechanics as well. For example, you have a leader of each pantheon, then you have gods that you can summon with your cards, and you also have minions which you can summon with your cards. In Smite, you only really have the gods that you can play yourself. So the whole thing works a little differently, especially since not all gods are necessarily leaders of pantheons. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pros of the game, then the cons of the game, then the potential that I see, and some comparison to other games that already exist, and last but not least, I'm going to give you my verdict on the game so far. So, what I really like about the game, every round of it is unique. You play against different leaders, and those have different cards that they can even choose from, and the strategies that you can apply are already very, very different. And these different decks really allow for different kind of play styles. For example, you can have a full minion deck and really focus on spawning many minions and pressuring the enemy that way. Just cheap cards, for example, you can focus to get high level cards and just work towards that and survive until that happens. Or what some people do at the moment is they get cards that buff the leader of their pantheon, so he has more health and more damage, and basically have the leader take down everything the enemy has instead of focusing on using your minions. As that is already possible in such an early stage, you can see how this can develop in a way that there are very different playstyles and you have to understand a lot about the game to counter them all appropriately. And still, obviously, there's a bit of the luck of the draw whenever you have a card game. I feel like the game has a very nice mix of a card and a board game at the moment, which I feel like is something that hasn't been done all too often, and it feels really interesting to me. The animations and the graphics look very, very good for that sort of game. Obviously, a lot of this is basically transferred over from Smite and just re-rendered in a lower resolution, basically. But it really makes the game stand out in that regard. It really makes it look very and feel very smooth already, while having nice 3D graphics, which really not every game in that genre can boast with. Many of the sound effects and abilities from Smite already feel familiar to those who have played Smite, which is a nice feeling for the transition. It's just nice to have that feeling of recognizing something from somewhere else. So the transfer in that way is a lot easier. The game has a very low demand when it comes to what it requires from your PC, so it's very available to many, many players, I think, especially since we don't really have many settings yet and still is very fluid on pretty much every system. I think the game is very easy to pick up. It only takes you a few rounds to learn everything and understand everything. The abilities are easy enough to use. And regardless of that, I think very strategical plays will be possible down the road when there are a few more cards and stuff like that, really allowing for you to develop your own deck and play style. The concept as a whole is also not too time consuming, which I think is important for the game and gives us some further potential, which we'll talk about later. That also brings us to the cons though. When we're talking about the cons, we have to say the concept in itself is not time consuming, but at the moment, the rounds are extremely long. I think you have 120 seconds, which is basically 2 minutes per round, and you usually don't have more than 3 to 4 characters to move and some other decisions to make. You can take that long for a round if you really think hard, but in the end, this is not chess, and I think half the time would still be enough because you spend a lot of the time waiting for the enemy to make their move if they don't end their turn early, which kind of feels unnecessary to me. Speeding the game up a little bit in that regard will do a lot for it, and I am fairly certain that's gonna happen at some point of the later alpha stages. Talking about alpha stages, there are obviously other downsides that come with the alpha stage. For example, at the moment the game crashes quite frequently. Once again, this is alpha. This is nothing that I will complain about in more depth than this. It's really something that will probably be polished out in the beta stages. So just for now, it's worth mentioning anyways, but not going into detail. Balance is also still kinda wonky. For example, I figured that if the enemy ends up with an Aphrodite plus Athena combo, you are pretty much done unless you have really, really good cards all of a sudden. And stuff like that can be kind of frustrating. Obviously, once again, balance is something that will be touched more at later stages, and as such, doesn't need too much addressing. One thing I'd like to point out in that particular regard, though, is the leaders. You have 3 leaders at the moment. 2 of them have ranged attacks, 1 doesn't, which is Odin. And that guy feels a lot weaker than the others. He still has a nice ability, which is buffing the minions around him, or 1 minion around him with an extra power buff for a round, but it doesn't nearly compete to what, for example, Ra offers, who can heal allies in a range, in a bigger radius, for 1 per round. So basically heals multiple targets, while Odin can only buff 1 for the same damage that he can heal. And Ra also can do ranged attacks on top of that. So really there is a disparity in what they bring to the table. Odin has 2 more health, which will never make up for all the downsides that he has compared to the others. And this is something that obviously intertwines with the decks and stuff as well, and something that will be fixed over time, but is worth pointing out for the moment. What I also feel that certain card effects are very, very strong, and as they don't run out, every card effect lasts forever at the moment, they can be very brutal. For example, Athena's Taunt is one of those. She keeps taunting whoever she gets close to, instead of just doing that for the first 3 rounds after spawning or something like that, and that can really throw off your game very, very hard. I think also those effects will need some tuning down. There is stuff like the bushes, which is kind of a mix of an upside and downside. At the moment, I feel like it's a nice effect, a nice bonus to how the game works, but they also are very, very strong in that regard and may need some fine-tuning, which kind of brings us to the potential. When it comes to the potential, I think the game has a lot of potential, especially since it's in such an early stage and it's already kind of fluid to play. I think especially with the map interactions, there's more potential. So for example, you could have something like the rocks reducing range damage, but allowing you to shoot through them and stuff like that. There is something that could be worked out in that regard. And I think you could do a lot more around it than it is so far. There's obviously more potential when there are more cards. You can have a lot more variety than we have so far, which is great, because at the moment the card pool is kind of limited. The cost can be fine-tuned when it comes to many of the cards, because some cards just don't really feel equal to others. The point gain per win can be fine-tuned. At the moment you get a lot more points for logging in daily instead of actually winning games, which I can understand to some extent, but it doesn't really feel right when you have, I think, to have like nearly 10 wins to get the same that you get for daily login or something like that. Some crazy amount at least. Then I think there's also potential for a mobile version down the road. Like I said, the whole thing doesn't seem to be too taxing, and really the whole concept of the game is nothing that requires high-level graphics, and it would be a really chill game to play on a phone, in my opinion. And last but not least, something that has been mentioned in previous videos by me as well, but for those who just come in for this one, it's worth pointing out that this has a lot of potential for streamers in a queue. If you are in Smite queue and the rounds of Smite Tactics are not as long anymore, then those games are something that can be played while waiting in queue to get a game in Smite, which I think is really cool. Then we come to the point of comparisons. There is the obvious comparison to Duelist. I have never played Duelist. I heard from some people in my chat that they felt that Duelist was very unrefined back in the days, so they wouldn't really compare it, but when it comes to the whole mechanics of the game, there's obviously a huge overlap. I feel like what I saw from just looking at Duelist a little bit, Duelist seems to have less map interaction and less refined graphics. Those are pixel graphics, which in my opinion don't look as great, but that's a matter of taste. There's also obviously the comparison to Hearthstone, which to some extent makes sense because it's a card game in both regards, but then again, it's a board game, so it's kind of different. You could draw comparisons to Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh!, chess, and you would not be wrong. Like, all these games obviously play in when you make a mix of a card game and a board game, but I don't think that's a problem, because it's not too similar to any of those except Duelist, really, and it stands out in its own ways, and it shows that it has potential to become its own game, its own niche, and that's what matters to me. I don't care what a game is based on. I have played Warcraft, which was based on Warhammer. I have played Overwatch, which was based on Team Fortress. I have played Paladins, which was based on Overwatch. And I couldn't care less if a developer takes inspiration from other games as long as he makes the game better. I know that some people are really elitist about this, but I just couldn't care less. If somebody is going to make a Warcraft 3 ripoff that is the best strategy game that will come out in the next years, then please do, because I'm waiting for that, and I'm not joking here. Okay, and with that, we come to the verdict about the game so far. I think in its current state already, despite of being really alpha, the game is really, really fun. I really enjoyed playing Smite Tactics so far, and I will definitely play it more. I think it's a little irritating when you first come into it, because you get thrown against enemies who seem to have played the game a lot more, but once again, this is alpha, so there won't be too many people playing. So those different levels of experience will eventually even out. And what I especially think is that the game has a lot of potential to grow and really work out as a quick, fun game that you can play in breaks and hopefully on mobile, then wherever, in school or whatever, wherever you want to play it. So anyways, that sums it up for me. I hope this was interesting for you. I hope this was insightful and gives you a bit of an opinion. What I'd like to hear from you guys in the comments of this video is if you want to see raw gameplay of Smite Tactics where I comment on my decisions and all that stuff. I have some of that and I could upload it, but I don't know how many people would like to see it. With that, thank you guys for watching. I will be streaming tomorrow throughout the day, EU time, so if you want to stop by, feel free to do so. Until then, see you for the next video tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.